Last week, we started a brand new series with you, talking about generations a little bit. We discovered last week that within our church is an amazing organism. All these people gathered together. It's continued on for 2,000 years. Amidst all the persecution, turmoil that's kind of gone on in the church, it's just continuing right on. And within the church body, you're the church. The church is not a building, it's people. The church isn't a building, it's people. And within that, there's ethnic diversity, there's cultural diversity, there's all kinds of diversity, but if we're really honest with ourselves, there's generational diversity in here as well. And I've already gotten bawled out by a couple of people. You forgot a whole generation. What about those of us born in the 70s? Well, you didn't do anything amazing, so we just skipped right over you last week, all right? So we kind of did the whole great generation. The baby boomers went right into the millennials. And within that whole thing, there's all this turmoil. And I think the generational divide is more pronounced today than it ever has been in the history of the church. And kind of where we landed last week was this, that regardless what your style of music might be, regardless of what your preferences are as far as what church ought to be like, when you're dead, cold, and rotting in the grave, the church is going to continue on because this is Jesus' thing right here, okay? This is all about Jesus' thing. And his message is going to continue to go on regardless of your preferences that are personal to your generation. And so it's my intent over the next couple of weeks to help us narrow the gap between generations. And today, I want to help mentor a generation to win spiritually. And that's where we're going to go today, to mentor the next generation spiritually. Next week, I want to talk about mentoring the next generation financially. But today, I want to talk about mentoring the next generation to win spiritually. And I think one of the most powerful ways that we can do that within the church is with stories. It's storytelling. Especially to a younger generation that's coming up. It's less about one guy standing up here in the front and just declaring, "Thus says God, so you better believe this." There's a generation that comes up that's not unlike many generations through the history of humanity that connect by hearing a story. So much of what we read, so much of what we know about history was done orally. It was oral tradition passed on from generation to generation. Somewhere along the line, we have kind of dropped the ball in the church. I'm not sure where, and I'm not sure how. But all of us in this room have a story to tell, and a lot of us have untold stories. The older you get, the more stories you have to tell, because the life experience is just there. And there's a lot of reasons we might not tell our stories. Let's just be honest. All of us have embarrassing stories. We've got things for which we feel shame and guilt. Sometimes we just think there's things in our story that are just unimportant. Or if I tell my story, how will I be perceived or received? Because let's just be honest, up to this point, it's kind of been image management. Everybody knows you this way, right? And if our story is untold, it's a secret. But a secret revealed becomes a story. I'll say it again, that a story untold can be a secret, but a secret revealed can be a story. I want to know what your story is. And secrets can be the barriers that divide relationships, that divide generations. But a story, suddenly a story can be the building blocks to create the bridge from one generation to the next. And there's a generation today, if you're in the older generation, there's a younger generation beckoning you. They want to hear your story. They want to know your struggles. They want to know the challenges. They want to know how you overcame those struggles. They want to know that you're a real person. And there's a generation that doesn't necessarily want to know your secrets, but they want to know your story. If we're really honest with ourselves, all of us have this common link when it comes to our stories. And the common link is this: all of us are human beings. And I would say that there's probably nothing unique to your story that somebody else in this room hasn't also shared in their story. And when we start to understand that there's this common link of humanity, that, you know what, your story is not so much different than my story. We've all had these battles and we've all had these struggles. We had a struggle to get to faith, and we've got a struggle in the faith. And if we can start to understand the commonality of our stories, that our stories link us together, then we can listen to somebody else's story and we can approach another person with empathy. Not compassion, but empathy. Compassion is to see somebody who's down in the pit and offer them something to eat and give them a cold drink of water. That's compassion. Empathy is to go down in the pit and sit there with them and experience their experience with them. And once we start to understand that our experiences are so similar, we can feel an empathy and understand, you know what, our stories are really not so different whatsoever. And we can learn from one another's narratives. We're going to see an amazing example of somebody that built a bridge through stories. If you brought a device today or your Bible and you want to find the book of John, if you need to use an index, don't feel bad about that whole thing. John is one of the 4 New Testament Gospels. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then we're going to go to John today. We're going to be in John chapter 4. If you've grown up in the church, you know this story. It's a familiar story to you. But we're going to tease some things out of this story, and I love it because it deals with Jesus who knows all, sees all, and loves all, and then another character in the story whose story is maybe not so different than your story, and how the two of them get linked together. As you get to John chapter 4, it starts out at the beginning of the chapter just talking about a day in the life of Jesus. He's walking from Judea to Galilee, and I don't really know the distance. I tried to find the distance for you, but there was a direct route from Judea to Galilee, and it went through the country of Samaria. Now, normally Jews, when they traveled this route, they didn't go through Samaria. They went around Samaria. They walked the long way. I mean, how un-American is that? There's nobody that would take the long way to get somewhere, right? We'll drive over somebody or through something to get to where we want to go. But this day, when you get to John chapter 4 and verse number 4, it says, Jesus had to go that way. He had to go that way. The verbiage that is using is like there was something inside of Jesus that said, I can't go the normal route of the other Jews. And I'll tell you why they did this in a moment. I have to go through Samaria. If you don't know, the Samaritans were kind of a half-breed ethnic group. They'd been around for about 700 years. The Jews hated them. They wanted nothing to do with them. They weren't even worth the dust that clung to your feet when you walked through the country of Samaria. And so the Jews would purposely go all the way around to avoid that place. But this day, Jesus, he was going to take the shortcut. He had to go through Samaria. Verse 5 says that eventually Jesus came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. That's a historical figure back in the Old Testament. This is the Jacob who had an encounter with God, and his name would be changed to Israel, from which the nation of Israel would come. Joseph is mentioned here, one of the 12 sons that became one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The story goes on that Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well. It was about noontime. John was an eyewitness to this whole account, although we're going to see in the story that when Jesus gets to the well, the other disciples, they just kind of go on. They're going to go into Burger King or Chick-fil-A or something and get something to eat and bring it back out to the well. But I would imagine there's maybe kind of a rock retaining wall that went around this well. It would have been common to do at the time. A place to rest when you made the journey to get there. The well is about a half mile from the little village of Sychar. And whenever we read scriptures, we could compress everything down as though it just took place instantaneously. But this day, Jesus sits down at the side of the well. I don't think there was anybody else there. The narrative seems to indicate that Jesus was by himself. As Jesus looks up, noticing somewhere off in the distance, a speck, perhaps, a figure moving. As the figure draws closer, it says in verse number 7 that it was a Samaritan woman who came to draw water, and Jesus saw her. Now I'm going to pause right there because John, of course, writes this and he compresses it all down. In my mind, I'm reading the story and I see this Samaritan woman coming, probably carrying an earthen vessel on the top of her head. In the other hand, she's carrying likely a bucket and a rope. And so with these two items, she walks to the well, covered in the traditional garb of the time, and there sits Jesus wearing the garments of a rabbi. It's obvious that he's a Jew. And Jesus, I think, is there sitting on that stone retaining wall, and I think he's watching the whole process and procedure as the woman lowers the earthen jar down to the ground. She takes the bucket now and she drops it down into the hole that is in the ground where the well was, and she begins to let out the rope so as not to tangle it as it goes down. We read that the well was likely about 75 feet deep. And I think Jesus is just watching all of this. Not a word of dialect. The bucket hits the water down below. She can tell by the slack in the rope. And haven't you ever wondered, I've always wondered, and maybe you know how do you get the bucket to tip and get water in it when it gets down to the surface? She was an expert because she had done this probably twice a day for most of her life. She hoists the bucket of water back up to the surface. The sunlight reveals the glistening water inside, and then at that moment, Jesus says, "Give me a drink." Well, as we're going to continue to read, you could have cut the tension in the air with a knife. Look how it reads out in verse number 8. He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. Traditionally, culturally, a man would never speak to a married woman alone like that. The story goes on in verse 9. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. In fact, she said to Jesus, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" I'll tell you why. Because Jesus knew something about her, and Jesus has a story to tell her, and Jesus wants to hear her story. Jesus wants to build a bridge culturally between two different cultures. Generationally, there's an onus on us that we would listen to the next generation, that we would tease out the stories of another generation who's experienced things that we never had. Friday being Veterans Day, listening to the radio, listening on a call-in talk show as veterans called in and shared their experiences. I was glued to every word that they said. We in the younger generation love to hear the stories of the older generation. Verse number 10 says, Jesus replied, if only you knew the gift God has for you and who you're speaking to, you would have asked me, and I'd give you living water. I tried to translate this over in the modern day a little bit here. Can I have a cup of coffee? Well, you don't even have a coffee cup. Oh, don't worry about that. Because if you know who you're talking to, you know what? I'd get you some special coffee. It's magic coffee. If you drink it, it's like living coffee. Yeah, I've had that before. It's a quad shot, whatever, I don't know. Anyway. Verse 11 says, but sir, you don't even have a rope or a bucket. And this well is very deep. How can you get this living water? Jesus here is speaking spiritually. She's thinking naturally, as so often is the case when we communicate with Jesus. And she's thinking, I've drawn water out of here a lot of times. Is there a different hole kind of deeper down? Where are you going to get this whole thing? Verse 12, and besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob who gave us this well? And how can you offer better water than he and his sons and animals enjoyed? This is good water in this well. Okay. Jesus says, anybody who drinks this water, soon they're going to become thirsty again. Well, that's not rocket science. This woman knew that. Everybody comes out to the well to get water, and the reason we come out to the well to get water is because we get thirsty. Verse 14, but you know what? Those who drink the water that I give, I got a different water. I've got some water that will give you, and you'll never be thirsty again. It becomes fresh, bubbling, spring within you, giving eternal life. You know what I love about this story? Mom and Dad, listen to me for just a little bit. You know what Jesus is doing here? He is taking the ordinary, and he's making a story from it. He did this all the time with what we call parables. In fact, in Psalm 78, it says we're supposed to use parables to tell the next generation. In other words, use the ordinary. Mom and Dad, use the time that you're in the kitchen. Use the time, dads, that you're in the garage. Use the time that you're out hunting. Use the time that you're going through your own struggles. Use your personal everyday experiences to somehow translate a spiritual principle to the children that are watching every move you make and listening to every word you say. Jesus did that so beautifully for us here. Verse 15, please, sir, the woman said, give me the water and then I'll never be thirsty again and I won't have to come back and get water out of this well. This is like a no-brainer. Yeah, I want this. She's not thinking spiritually at all. She's thinking, if you've got some magic water, that would be awesome. I will drink it one time. I'll never have to drink again. And I won't have to make the half-mile trek out to this dusty old hill and get some water out of the well every day. This would be awesome. It would free up some time in my day. I could do dishes, do some laundry, do some ironing. It would be great. And then the story that Jesus is telling about this whole water business creates a desire within her. And Jesus is about to draw something from the well of her life, just like she drew from the well of water. And he's going to do it with one simple statement. And in this simple statement and in the interaction that he's about to have with this woman, we're going to see something so remarkable about the character and the nature of Jesus, and I think what he's trying to pattern for you and for me to the world in which we live. Jesus is going to help create a story that's going to heal and reveal. But healing can't come before there's revealing. He makes one simple statement to her, and I just think Jesus maybe had a little glint in his eye, because Jesus knows all, he sees all. And I think with a little glint in his eye, he says to the woman in verse 16, go get your husband, he told her. Just go get your husband. I mean, this has been a great conversation between the two of us, but now I want you to go get your husband. Jesus knew what he was up to. He's about to tease a story out of this woman. Verse 17 says, I don't have a husband. She probably thought, this is going to be the end of it. I don't have a husband. Let's just keep on the conversation. And Jesus said, you know what? You're right when you say you don't have a husband. Verse 18 says this, because the fact is you've had 5 husbands and you're not even married to the guy that you're living with right now. You are right on the money. Well, the truth has been revealed here. This woman this day, when she gets up to go out to the well to get some water, like she had done every day for most of her life, never anticipated having a conversation with a Jew, let alone a Jew that knew her past. And you know what I love about the story? Jesus never lectures her on her lifestyle. Jesus doesn't lecture her on the lifestyle. He doesn't start a whole sermon right here and say, well, you know what? I'll tell you why I've had 5 husbands and you're living with a guy right now. It's obvious that you've been trying to draw life out of the springs of your past history, and you feel like garbage. You have a low self-esteem and you're trying to get life out of the relationships you're in. But the problem with you need a relationship with me, then everything is going to go all right. And you should be ashamed of yourself living with a guy right now. You should go find the nearest rabbi and just get married today. Until then, I can't love you the way you want to be loved. You just need to change. Here's the question this whole interaction beckons from each of us in this room today. If we call ourselves a Christ follower, here's the question that we're posed with in this interaction with this woman. Can we love people in spite of their lifestyle, their preferences, their ideals or idealisms? Skin color, cultural background. Can we just love people without trying to change them before we love them? Yeah. Jesus just loved this woman right where she was. And I think he modeled that for the church. We're supposed to be a courtroom for those on the inside, not the outside. We're supposed to be a hospital for those on the outside as well as the inside. So he teases his story out. And you know what? You have a story to tell too. In fact, even sitting here today, some of you have a story. Oh, it's not a story yet. It's still your secret. Jesus knows it, however. Jesus knows the past. There are things that you have done. There are things you have experienced that nobody else has ever known. It's still your secret. But it's a story waiting to be revealed. And it's a story that can build a bridge with another generation because they want to know your struggles and how you've made it through. There's risk in telling the story. How will you be perceived and how will you be received? I'm always amazed when you attend a funeral and there's some person laying in that casket who has lived years for Jesus Christ. 98 years old. It's a full life, a full spiritual life. But then conversation ensues while we're all eating those nice cold ham sandwiches on a 20 below day in North Dakota. And having cold potato salad. Yeah, I'm not bitter, you can tell. All right. And as people are sitting around eating funeral food, the stories start about the person who's laying in the casket. We thought that Grandma Spufik was just this amazing woman. We thought she lived her life perfectly for Jesus Christ. But the truth starts to come out that, that there's a child that nobody knew about. Or the first child came, they were married and they were 6 months, there was a baby. They always say the first child, the gestation period can take any amount of time. The second and third and fourth, they take 9 months. We start to learn all these secrets. And suddenly we realize this was a real person. This was a person who went through struggles just like my own, only I never knew about it because they never told their story. They never brought us along in the journey. But I think if we're really honest about our own life and the stories created by it, we could only receive somebody else's story with a heart of empathy. There's no room for judgment in it. This woman, I think she was as uncomfortable with the whole idea as any of us would be in the same situation as Jesus begins to reveal this. In fact, she reveals her discomfort with Jesus kind of asking her about the whole marriage thing. The story goes on in verse 19. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. Or something. Like nobody else knew this whole kind of thing. So tell me now, she says, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem's the only place of worship and Samaritans, well, we have to worship here in Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshiped. In counseling world, you know what she's doing? She's deflecting. I don't want to talk about this right now. This is uncomfortable. This is a story I've not told a lot of people. I don't want anybody to know about this. Obviously, you know about it, but I still don't want to talk about it. So let's talk about church. You can read the rest of the narrative. Jesus appeases her and has a conversation with her and kind of brings her up to speed on where things are in her life. So he doesn't dodge all the questions, but he still gets back to the real issues in her heart. And so as the conversation ensues, apparently, they had a longer conversation and something stuck. Jesus told her a story, and I have a feeling that Jesus told a story about her life to her. She already knew it, but Jesus told the story. He told his story. He told a story about hope. He told a story about redemption. He told a story about forgiveness. And the woman goes back to her Samaritan village, and she tells somebody that something happened at the well today, because in verse number 39 it says, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I ever did. She thought it was a secret to the whole town, but you've lived in a small town maybe. You know what it's like in a small town. Before truth can get its pants on, the rumors all the way across town have settled in. They all knew, but she didn't think they knew. And so she goes back and suddenly it's not a secret. She's found freedom. She's found hope. She's found liberty in telling her secret, in telling her story. And in doing that, there was a connection between her and Jesus. Jesus crossed the cultural boundaries. He had to. The challenge I'm posing all of us is that we will cross the generational boundaries. The grandparents will tell their children. The children will tell their children. And the stories go on, and we are honest about our daily struggles and our personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Her secret became a story, and her story had an impact on the entire town. I think one of the best gifts one generation can pass on to the other spiritually is to tell our spiritual journey. Let's tell the next generation how we did it and how we overcame these things. Tell us about your struggles. Grandma and Grandpa, tell us about your struggles. Mom and Dad, tell us about your struggles. And I think parents, pull back. We don't want to tell our kids about our spiritual struggle. We certainly don't want to tell them about 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, because we think if we tell them that story, it's going to mean that we approve of them doing the same thing. You're trying to have this persona as being the perfect parent who never made mistakes growing up. Let me just clue you in on something. Your kids already know that you ain't perfect, all right? They already know. And telling the story doesn't give approval to what you did. But what an amazing opportunity to say, this is what I learned. Please don't repeat. To those in the generation ahead, we just say, bring us along on your journey. Tell us your story. And when we tell you our story, please don't draw the wrong conclusion about me. Please love me right where I am. Please accept me right where I am. Because I'm like that woman at the well. All of us in this room have skeletons in our closets. Don't we? Well, Robin and I do, at least. Put yourself in my place. Listen to my story. Understand me before you try to change me. You know what can so easily happen, I think, as generations get older, is there's a hardening of the attitude. It's difficult to accept the changes in the generations that follow. And it's changing so quickly, let's just be honest, it's scary sometimes. But I'm telling you, let's build the bridge to the next generation. Let's speak to the younger generations. Let's inspire the next generation. And let's inspire the younger generation by telling the stories of our struggles, of our faith, of God's power, of our past, of us overcoming it, and how it was difficult. And let's just be honest and real in the whole thing. Younger generations, honor the older generations. Listen to the story. Ask them to come into your life. Ask them to be a part of your narrative. Ask them to come into your world and speak truth into the places where you struggle today. Who is it that needs to hear your story? Who is it that needs to hear your story? To whom do you need to tell your story? Without drawing a conclusion about that person because of their story. Because in all honesty, all of us have very similar stories. And maybe your story is unfinished. It's still unfinished. It's in the process of being written. The pages of your life become the tablet, the parchment, and God starts to write with the blood of his son Jesus on that parchment. And he writes redemption and healing, forgiveness and acceptance. And that's the beginning of the journey, and then we just go on. Are there struggles along the way? Oh yeah, there's struggles along the way. But that becomes your story to tell the next generation, and you can do it. But today maybe is the day that you need to receive Jesus and say yes to him for the very first time, and your story is going to start today.